Igor Tudor has now officially been announced by the club as the interim boss.
I'm here not to enjoy, I'm here to work.
And still Ricky Villa! What a fantastic run! He scored!
Gascoigne going to have a crack. He is, you know. Oh, it's there!
Here's Lucas Moura! Oh, they've done it! The wait for silverware is over!
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Tottenham Way. I'm here, Tom Allnutt from The Times, with Tom Barclay from The Sun. It was meant to be the game of, salvation, rescue mission, when all the vibes kind of went skyward, and instead it was another disaster for Spurs. Tom, I think maybe we should start with Igor Tudor and just say, obviously, our best wishes are very much with him, because it was a sort of a reminder, I guess, at full time that, for all the disastrous things that are happening to Spurs, that it is only football, that, there are more important things in life, clearly. And obviously we heard in the press conference afterwards that Tudor couldn't carry out his post-match media duties due to an immediate family bereavement. So we wish him the best. And it's obviously a very difficult situation for him. I mean, maybe that's where we start, Tom. We were both in the press conference afterwards. Do you want to just explain how that happened and what occurred? And you asked a couple of questions about it as well, didn't you?
I did. Hi, Tom. Yeah. First off, as you say, Tom, our best wishes are with Igor and his family. It sounds, just the situation is is not good for him. So we were in the press conference. We were waiting for him to come through, expecting to sort of, I guess, grill him a little bit on what just occurred on the pitch. And then we got a message through that he wouldn't be taking it, and Bruno Saltor, his assistant, would be taking it instead because of this situation with his passing of an immediate family member. And we were just trying to sort of find out a bit more sort of reaction, I suppose. We obviously didn't push it too far at all, but I just asked Bruno, how Igor was doing. And I think he said he kept it very sort of to the facts. He just said it's a personal family issue, and obviously it's a difficult moment for him. We're just trying to support him in the best way we can. I did then ask, was it the fact that did he know before the game? Just because it felt quite. I think fans would want to know, whether throughout the match he was grappling with this personal circumstance or not. And to be fair to Bruno, he didn't go any further. He just kept to that line before, which is totally fair enough. And that was the end of it, really, regarding that. Any more specifics around that particular issue, I suppose, we'll probably find out more in the coming weeks. But it's kind of up to him and his family, really, whether what kind of information comes out. But as you said from the top, Tom, regardless of the result today and the situation Tottenham are in, it very much puts everything into perspective, and we hope that Igor and his family are coping as well as they can.
Absolutely. I mean, it's always a fine balance, isn't it, Tom? I think as journalists in these situations, because obviously you sort of want to know some of the details, I guess, just to kind of understand the context and maybe the timeline. But equally, clearly, the priority I think that we always have in our minds is whether or not it's our business, really, and whether or not it serves any kind of purpose to include it in any of our coverage. And I think it was very fair, and I think very much what we all kind of felt, that beyond what the club said and what Bruno Saltor said afterwards, probably wasn't really in our interest or in anyone else's interest, really. It's clearly very much a private matter for Igor Tudor. So, as you say, we wish him very much the best, and until we find out more from the club on an official basis, that's as much as we know for now. Tom, let's talk about the game, obviously, and maybe the build-up, because I think it all kind of happened, in one big package today, doesn't it? There's obviously the performance and the result, but I think it's even more kind of crushing and deflating, really, when it comes in the context of what went before. I guess before we kind of get into the specifics of either of those things, what is your kind of take now? Here we are sitting, Sunday evening, a few hours after kind of full time. How big a blow was this defeat for Spurs?
Yeah, I think you got it right with that word, crushing. It really was. I know that your brother sent you a text that you shared with us after the game, which I don't know if you want to go into, but essentially how everything really was there for Spurs, whether it be the show of support, the amazing show of support before the game. I got there quite early because I knew obviously this was all happening, and I wanted to get a real feel for what it was actually like. And even though I was aware how many fan groups were behind this show of support and how many players have shared it, so you expected quite a lot of people on the streets, I was still pretty blown away by the 10,000 I think we estimated on the high road outside the ground as to sort of welcome the bus to come in. It really felt like the fans were doing the best they could in this particular game and in the match itself, with the atmosphere, until it was really completely over towards the end. And then obviously you got the aspect of Forest having played on Thursday, being taken to extra time, to penalties against FC Midtjylland in the Europa League. And even though Igor Tudor had said in his press conference that this was no advantage on Spurs because Vitor Pereira had obviously made mass changes, there was still lots of minutes for the likes of Elliot Anderson, the likes of Morgan Gibbs-White. I think they came on in the 75th minute, so you've still got all of extra time. And even if they hadn't played, all that extra travelling to take it out of you. And just off the back of what had been a really positive week with the gritty fighting spirit of a point at Anfield rather than the sort of quality, but that kind of characteristic we've seen in so short supply over the season. And then the win over Atletico, even though they went out on goal difference, showing the fact that they are still good players. They were playing quality football. They were the two takeaways that I have from those games. It really felt like this was there for Spurs to really try and turn it around. And, I guess we'll break down the game, but essentially I thought they did quite well in the first half. They couldn't without making loads of clear-cut chances, and they didn't really make their pressure count. Got hit with a sucker punch just before half-time, which they should do better on, but it was kind of going against the run of play. And I felt, to be honest, that some of the decisions that Tudor made from a substitution point of view did impact Spurs' chances quite a lot. They had 2 subs made at half-time. I know I'm touching on a lot of things here and we'll get into more detail, but I think that did change the game because Spurs were nowhere near as good in the second half and Forest took full advantage. So now we sit here, late on Sunday evening. Luckily for Tottenham, West Ham lost at Aston Villa, but in terms of your rounds analogy of every weekend being a round that these clubs that are embattled in this relegation, it was a real chance for Spurs to make the most of it, and they've been not knocked out, but they've taken a serious body blow this weekend.
Yeah, I mean, just so many factors in their favour going into this match, right? And you're right, I should say that this was my brother James who kind of flagged this up to me. Just the momentum, the fact that Forest are not a good team. It's the one thing you didn't mention there, Tommy. There were 7 league games without a victory themselves. Only Wolves have played more matches this season where they haven't scored any goals, and they come here and they score 3 against Spurs, and you're right, at the end of a week where Spurs felt like there was a little bit of momentum after Liverpool and Atletico, and then what was a really impressive kind of pre-match hype parade, from the fans, as you said, thousands of people on the high road waiting there for 2 or 3 hours before kickoff, gathering. Brilliant scenes, scenes that you see, reminded me of the Europa League celebrations. It was that kind of feel, wasn't it? It was like it was a cup final day, and okay, Spurs weren't at Wembley, but it felt like a cup final atmosphere at Spurs, and you just kind of think when they have all these things in their favour and they're playing against Nottingham Forest at home and they can't even get over the line in this match, and not only not get over the line but end up with a thumping at home, you think, who can they be? Because it's not going to be every single week where they're going to play against Nottingham Forest, where they're going to play a team who have been in Denmark on Thursday night in Europa League, where they're going to play on the back of 2 decent performances, where they're going to play on the back of 10,000 fans being outside and plumes of blue and white smoke up the high road. Like, they're not going to have these advantages every week. And I guess, it touches on what you said there, which is, it felt to me like the deflation at the end from the players and also from the fans was because of the build-up, because they knew that everyone knew what the magnitude of this match was, that everyone had put so much emotional energy into it. For it then not to deliver, it feels like the kind of the the blow is even more profound, right? Like, it's not big, and it sort of feels almost high risk. When I think about it now, I'm like, oh, maybe should they have built this game up so much? Because how do you come back from it? That's the problem that I see now, is how do you get the fans to do it again? How do you raise the players up again? And of course, the big question which we have to come to, is where do they turn now? In terms of Tudor and in terms of the management question. And I guess maybe they have a 3-week break, so clearly there's a pause there, which may be a good thing. But there was so much put into this match. I think not to get the win, it feels like a really damaging blow, I have to say.
It does. I thought after Crystal Palace, I was being quite doom and gloom, to be honest. I think you guys were being a bit more positive, but I actually said after the game, I think Spurs might go down. Just because if it wasn't the fact that it's the name Tottenham Hotspur, all the other indicators would suggest that they are the most likely of this clutch of teams because of their form, because of their injuries, because of the fact that they keep, they've changed managers, and Tudor at the time, and this was obviously before this little mini revival, which may have been completely sort of exploded with this particular performance, but because he kept changing things and didn't really seem to stick to one thing throughout the time, throughout each game, like learning new things when he hasn't got any time to learn any of this stuff. He's got to get there because we're running out of time. And then we had this, as I said, Liverpool was such a surprise. I mean, I know Liverpool are a poor team at the moment this season, but Spurs never get anything there. And I thought they played well, but as I said before, it was the spirit which they haven't shown for so long that gave me sort of more confidence. And then Atletico, the quality of the football. I mean, that move, back to Atletico, the move that where Tell should have squared, as well as Tell played, he should have squared it for Gray or Moani. That, I think I said to you at the game, I was like, I don't think I've seen a better move by Tottenham all season, or if I can, it's been a long time since that happened, where Gray gets the ball, drives it forward, plays it in, Moani, good touch, onto Xavi. Xavi, first time ball through, Tell, he should square it, he doesn't, but it was really great to see and reminded us all, these guys are good at football, they're not a terrible team. But then you get this performance, the second half performance, and this sort of collapse, and just how easy it seemed to be for Forest in the end. Forest team, as you say, who aren't great, definitely not great at scoring goals, and they've got problems up front. I mean, Igor Jesus, who scored the first goal, that's his third Premier League goal this season. He's not like a prolific striker in this league. And corners wise, that was. Spurs were clearly targeting it because Forest have got the second worst record from conceding goals from corners in the league, and they were racking them up. And Spurs are the second best at attacking them, and it just feels so Spursy, for the want of another word, or Dr. Tottenham, whatever phrase you want to use. That Tottenham go and then concede from a corner. Just the way things are going, and the more you sort of put it all together. It's hard to just think at this point that they are going to get out of it. And that's kind of where I've been left, right back down to that sort of depressing thought that it actually could happen.
I personally have a slightly more positive take. I still think I maybe we'll come to it later, but I mean, I still think for less reasons than before, it should be said, but I still think for 2 or 3 reasons, I can still see that Spurs will somehow get out of this. But I think the Atletico point is a good one, because I've been kind of racking my brains in the last couple of hours thinking, was that all a bit of a sort of, a mirage, that kind of Atleti performance? Was it just because Atleti were 5-2 up and therefore they were kind of happy to lose the game by 1 goal, and maybe they were happy for Spurs to have the ball and to punch the ball about, the place and look, like $1 million? Did we all kind of get a bit carried away? But I agree, and I think it's a good example. That move they put together was a good one. The way they passed the ball with so much more conviction in that game and so much more confidence, it was a good performance. I almost think the Liverpool draw was almost a little bit more of a smash and grab. I mean, maybe that's unfair, not smash and grab, because they played quite well, and I think they deserved a point in the end against Liverpool. But it was one of those where, they could have lost the game, and they could have even lost the game after they equalised. I mean, it was a funny one, right? Liverpool in a strange moment themselves. But I really thought the Atletico performance was one of the most sort of convincing attacking displays we've seen from Spurs in a long time. So is the conclusion, Tom, that this team just plays well when they're not under pressure?
Yes.
The fact is that maybe the whole reason the whole season where they've been good in the Champions League is because they sort of, either they don't want to play under pressure, or maybe they checked out of the Premier League. Maybe this whole relegation battle just cannot get these players going. Like, it's not even a matter of kind of motivation or selfishness. It's just because they can't really motivate themselves to want to finish 16th rather than 17th or 18th. Like, is that the fundamental problem that they have here?
I don't know about that. I just think the pressure of it just seems to grip them and petrify them at times, where there's just nothing. That game against Atletico, Mickey van der Ven said it in the build-up. This is there's nothing to lose. There just isn't anything to lose. There's no pressure on that game whatsoever. I said to in the presser before this Forest game to Tudor, I was like, it was a really good performance, but arguably there was no pressure on the team. No one expected Spurs to get through. Everyone thought it was over at half time with 5-2 down in aggregate. So how will this team, who have historically cracked under any pressure, particularly at home, cope when the pressure is really ramped up for this Forest game? And Tudor pushed right back and said, "Pressure? Who's saying that? Who said there was no pressure? There was pressure." But I don't think there was. I don't think there was any expectation in the Champions League. And then, you can talk about, I don't know if you remember that Anthony Gordon presser for Newcastle ahead of one of the Champions League games, where he was asked about the difference between the Premier League and the Champions League. And it's one of those answers, because he's a very he's a good talker, Gordon, kind of went viral. And he talked about the intensity of the Premier League and how just difficult it is compared to the Champions League. That it seems weird to say this in the week where so many English teams have gone out. But generally, we look at Tottenham, it just seems to suit them better. That style, and they just really seem to struggle with the intensity. I guess it comes back to injuries.
Tom, you can't tell me that Atletico Madrid are a worse team than Nottingham Forest. Like, I can't on any level where we're talking about intensity and running and Atleti run and. But
look at Borussia Dortmund. I mean, they're second in the Bundesliga. I think they've lost 2 games. You can't tell me they're a bad team, but they were rubbish at Spurs. I mean, Spurs did well to beat them, and it was one of the best performances of the Thomas Frank reign. But Dortmund really were average that night and were there for the taking. Atletico were better, much better than that the other day, but they were still had their problems. And they didn't. I don't know. I mean, Forest looked a lot more solid at the back today than Atletico did the other day. I mean, we're about to go into the performance, and like I said from the beginning, the first half had a lot of encouraging signs, and actually felt like it was more like Spurs were growing into the game and gaining momentum, and that's why it felt like the goal they conceded went against the run of play. But actually, when you sort of break it down, I mean, how many clear-cut chances did they really produce?
I was going to say we had a conversation, Tom. Was it half time? Was it a full time where we were in the toilet next to the press box? This is the real behind the scenes insight you get here on the Tottenham Way, wasn't it? But I think I was saying to you whilst we were having a pee, I was like, Nottingham Forest are good, and the thing is that Tottenham are sort of waiting for a team to turn up here and just kind of like roll over and give them a kind of 2-0 win that they really need, right? And you kind of think, it's going to be Palace, it's going to be Forest, it's going to be West Ham, before them. But the problem is in the Premier League, and it's a cliche, right? But you watch Forest for 20 minutes and think, oh yeah, they got Gibbs White. Oh yeah, they got Hudson-Odoi. Oh yeah, they got Igor Jesus. They got Sangare. They got Elliot Anderson, who starts for England in midfield. Like, and you think, they're not going to just roll over here. They're not going to be a gimme victory, are they? And that is, no one's coming to Tottenham's rescue in this.
No one gives it to you.
Every game they play is a tough game.
It is. No one gives it to you.
I should say, guys, I was going to say after 18 minutes and that, inside story, we should just say to everyone, if you're listening and watching, please do give us a like and subscribe. If you're listening to us, then try us on YouTube. And if you are watching us on YouTube, then please do give us a subscribe, because we're pushing, I think, for 2,000 subscribers, which is great in our first few months. So we're really happy with that. If we could get over the line before the end of the season, we'd be really chuffed. So, and of course, as always, get in touch with us, the Tottenham Way Pod at gmail.com, the Tottenham Way Pod at gmail.com. We've got 3 weeks off now before the next game. Some people may be cheering as they hear that. And so we'll be doing, at least one Q&A pod, I think, over the next 2 or 3 weeks. So do get in touch with us with questions and comments and suggestions for topics. Tom, let's get into the game. The first half, you said it was good. And I tend to agree with you, actually. I thought in the first, Bruno Saltor said after the match in the press conference that for 44 minutes, he thought that Spurs were on top, very much in charge of the game. I mean, we should say that it was very clear from the off. I had it that Vicario, after 12 seconds, basically launched the ball from deep into the far corner. And that kind of set the tone with the whole match, that it was clear that Tottenham's strategy was very much back to basics, old school, 4-4-2. You said, didn't you, next to me, it was almost like watching like 1990s football again. You know, get the ball wide, get the ball in the box. I think there were 8 corners in the first half for Spurs, 2 for Forest. They put 15 crosses in. And it felt like a real sort of swarm of pressure, didn't it? It felt like Forest were really defending their box for basically most of that half. I mean, you're right. There weren't any sort of real golden opportunities. Richarlison had that header, I thought, at the far post, which I think he probably, should have done better with. There was one good move where Richarlison got slid down the side and he kind of flashed it across the box, but actually he was just offside anyway. And then, of course, they hit the woodwork twice. Once was Igor Jesus sort of flicking a cross onto his own post, and the next one was Tell hitting the crossbar, which was a good save by Sells just after Jesus had given Nottingham Forest the lead. Is it fair to say it was a really good performance? Was it just quite a good performance? Do you think Spurs were unlucky to be behind? Should they have definitely been ahead? Where do we kind of rate that first kind of 40 minutes in terms of the display?
Yeah, I think they were unlucky to be behind. Like I said, it felt like a bit of a sucker punch, albeit one of their own making. Jed Spence loses his marker for Jesus to head home. So, it's their own fault for not defending well enough. But overall, I think they very much shaded that first half. But as I said, without creating loads of chances, Richarlison could have done better. And it just felt like they were building towards something at that point. But you're right. I mean, I was sitting next to you, but in between us was your Times colleague and the sort of legendary player, Tony Cascarino, who obviously played during that period I was talking about. It really did remind me of the 90s Premier League, where 4-4-2 was the order of the day. You have 2 strikers up front, crosses being whipped in at every opportunity. 2 midfielders. When you hear Roy Keane talk about midfielders these days, and as if like they should just be able to do everything like he used to, but whereas now we generally get a playmaker or a holding midfielder or whatever you might feel. But today it felt like, when it was working at least, Sarr and Gray were playing in that kind of old school central midfield who just do a bit of everything. They get back, they go forward, they try and create, particularly Gray. And actually, before we get into the sort of doom-mongering part of this pod, which is be most of it because of the rest of the performance, just a word on Archie Gray, who's obviously had this amazing rise recently. Been by far and away the sort of biggest shining light of the last 6 weeks. I mean, you could really see it in that first half before it all went wrong. Every time he got the ball, there was an anticipation around us by the fans of like something might happen here, or if it wasn't him in possession trying to make something happen or putting a little dribble together, it was him often winning the ball. He's really grown in stature in these last few weeks, but then he also he took quite a blow, didn't he, with that challenge, sort of 50-50 that him and Sangare went into. And Sangare is a pretty burly guy. Anyone who crashes into him, you're going to come off in a little bit of pain. And it felt like at that point, Archie was limping around for quite a while. I wondered if he was going to carry on at that point. And I wonder, if that might have affected him. I wonder what his knee might look like tomorrow. I imagine he's got a bit of swelling off the back of that. I wouldn't be surprised. But I mean, that was the one positive I thought from an individual performance, along with Kevin Danso, who I thought slotted in pretty well and made some pretty good interventions. But the problem was, I guess the problem comes in second half. The changes I don't think worked, which we can come on to in a second. But also that midfield too of Gray and Sarr just got deeper and deeper, and the gap between attack, of which there was like 4 of them going forward, particularly when Bergvall came on for Porro, and the defence was just massive, and they didn't really have much of an idea. It was kind of back to the Thomas Frank days of Spurs not really having an idea of how to break down a team in open play, and Forest sort of took advantage of it from there.
I thought Gray was brilliant actually in that first sort of half an hour. And I actually thought in general across the whole game, I thought Gray was superb. And I have to say, I think I've said in this pod that I've had I wouldn't say doubts, but I think I've had my reservations about the kind of hype around Gray. Not least because I always felt like his most comfortable performances came at right back, and I always thought that when he played in central midfield, he never kind of grasped a game, by the scruff of its neck. He always sort of let it pass him by a bit, was always kind of playing a bit safe. But I really think in the last 3 or 4 weeks, Gray has basically looked around him and realised there's nothing to be afraid of here. There's no need for me to kind of over-respect everyone else in this team. Like, no one else is doing it, so why don't I?
Filled out as well, isn't he?
He's filled out. I think we've said that, haven't we? Yeah, in the last couple of weeks. He looks stronger. He no longer looks like that player who can just be pushed off the ball. He looks bigger, definitely. And I just think in terms of his presence and his aura, he looks like someone now who is prepared to kind of dominate a Premier League match. And that's a real plus. And it's difficult to find the pluses right now for Spurs. But amid the kind of doom and gloom, I do think he has really emerged, Archie Gray, as a proper central midfielder in this team.
Well, just on Archie, because ahead of this game, he was such a top topic. I spoke to Darren Anderson, who's obviously a Spurs legend. I was asking about Archie, and wow. He thinks he can be better than Declan Rice. That was kind of the sort of main takeaway from my chat with him. He thinks he's just got it all, and all the sort of kind of what you're saying, all the talk we've heard about how good he can be. He's now starting to live up to it. Now fitting into that central midfield position. Darren thought, he was an outside shout for the World Cup. I think it's probably too late now not being in the squad. And I would argue that, from Tuchel's point of view, even though he's picked quite an experimental squad for the upcoming friendlies against Japan and Uruguay, you can make a case that James Garner's been very, very consistent over the whole season. Kobbie Mainoo's obviously got the experience from playing at the Euros, going all the way there before, and has now come back into the fold at Man United. So I think it would have been a bit of a surprise for Gray to come this far already. But the fact that he was even in that conversation just shows how well he's played in the last 6 or 7 weeks. And I don't know, do you see comparisons to Rice? Because that's something that Frank said before. He said Rice and Rodri. And you were kind of thinking, wow, I'm quite sure what you're seeing. He's clearly a talented player. But now he's sort of commanding that midfield and has those different aspects to his game, kind of back to that Keane comparison. He's got a bit of everything. I can sort of see it now, I think.
I think his distribution has come on a lot. You see that sort of sizzled pass he sent out to Tell quite early on in the game. And I think Tell had a good chance. He had a good shot, I think, from it. He's passing forwards is better. He's playing it less safe. He's a great tackler. He's obviously a great runner. I think he, like Rice, he has that kind of engine. He goes back to his childhood days where he was a fantastic cross-country runner. Listen, Rice is one of the best central midfielders in the world right now. And I think, we can't say that about Archie. I think he's still got a way to go. But I can see the comparison in that sort of sense of an all-action kind of midfielder who gets up and down and can do a bit of everything. As I say, I really think in these last few weeks, it'd be ironic if Igor Tudor sort of is remembered almost a bit like Tim Sherwood is remembered for sort of bringing through, or at least giving the first chance to kind of Harry Kane. Maybe Igor Tudor's legacy will be giving the first sort of, not the first chance, but overseeing the emergence of Archie Gray.
Yeah, you're right. I could totally see that, because it feels like he's really turbocharged his development, hasn't he? I think he was showing signs of it in the latter days of Thomas Frank, but it really is during this Tudor period where he's really, really kicked on. One final thought on him before we get back to the misery, I imagine, regarding Archie, is his availability is one of his biggest strengths as well. In amongst all these, this terrible injury crisis ever since he's been at the club, a lot of which he has not benefited from, be the wrong phrase, but he's played more games than probably expected last year because of it at centre-back during that central defensive crisis. He's generally been fit the whole time. In fact, trying to think about it, maybe a couple of times I think he might have had a calf issue where he missed a few games. But even last year when he was, I think it was the Newcastle game, which they ended up losing at home in January, he was sick in his sick bed all week, like Dragosin was, and he still played the whole game. So, maybe it is back to that cross country history, as you point out. He's got that on his side, which is what we hoped with Conor Gallagher based on his history, and then he's obviously had a really minimal impact, really sadly so far for Conor. But Archie is showing up every week and becoming more and more the man with every passing week.
And I think Matty's Tell as well. I don't want to labour this point, but I think he had a good game again today, actually. And I thought in the first half, when Spurs were playing well, I thought a lot of their best attacks came from Tell. And I think that has been a pattern in the last few weeks. Again, I would put him in the same bracket as kind of Gray, as someone who's really stood up under Tudor, and maybe Tell has his own reasons and motivations for that. We know that it obviously didn't go well for him under Frank. We talked to him in the mix zone, didn't we, Tom, after Atletico? And he spoke very well, first of all, I'd like to say, in English, and he came across as a very sort of mature, level-headed guy. And he was talking about how the dressing room had kind of sat down and, really spoken honestly with each other about what he called the small details. And at that point, we were all kind of thinking, okay, there's a sort of sense of a corner turning here, which hasn't obviously materialised. But I think it felt in the stadium today, and I wonder if fans listening would agree with this, like he is now a player who the fans are really enjoying. Like when he went over to try and take corners, he got a really good reception every time he went over to the corner. He was kind of thrusting his arms up at the fans as if, come on, get behind us as well. I think there's a really nice connection there developing between the fans and Tell. And yeah, Spurs need him because, they haven't got that many kind of attacking players who can deliver. Tom, let's get on to the halftime subs, because I think you said, didn't you, at the beginning, you felt that was quite a big moment, and I think we were surprised, weren't we, to see those two subs. And we sort of thought, maybe Gray's going off because, as you said, we saw him do that challenge. And we thought, maybe he's injured. And we were trying to work out, and then suddenly we realised, okay, Van der Ven's not come out, and we thought maybe there was injuries, but we asked afterwards in the press conference, and Southall confirmed, to me about Bergwall and to someone else about Van der Ven, that both of them were tactical. So with tactical decisions, what do you think the thinking was, and do you think they paid off?
Well, the answer to that I've already given away. No, it didn't clearly at all. If anything, Spurs got a lot worse in the second half. I think the logic was that Destiny Udogie is a natural left back. Mickey Van der Ven isn't. And, he came off the bench the other day against Atletico, and he thought, they were 1-0 behind. He would make a big difference coming off the bench and being able to attack down that left-hand side. But I have to say, Udogie looked very rusty. Not surprising. Can't blame him. He's been injured for quite a long time and gave the ball away quite a lot. He had minimal impact going forward, really. And I don't think that worked at all. And then on the other side, it's obviously Porro's been playing right wing, which is not ideal. They're missing a right winger. They're missing Kudus. Although especially the way they're playing, they're trying to sling in crosses with the right foot. So I don't know, but I presume Kudus would play if he were fit. They're playing Porro there. He wasn't like he had a great first half. It's obviously not his natural position, but there was a bit more of a balance about the team. That was probably only more noticeable once he'd gone off and been replaced by Bergwall, who again himself looks, hasn't played for a long time. I know he came on the other day against Atletico. It was a nice surprise to see him back on the pitch, but he hasn't played for a long time. And even if he had, he's not a right winger, in this 4-4-2 system. And on the one hand, there have been times, I think, where Tudor has sort of mixed around with formation and playing, the old square pegs in round holes. And it has sort of worked. I thought against Atletico, Dragusin filling it right back and Porro playing further forward in a four in midfield did work, which is why he carried on with it. So it's not fair to sort of just batter him for saying he keeps playing players in the wrong position. But today, that particular change with those two players who just don't look up to speed seemed to really sort of check any momentum that Spurs may have had. And it wasn't long. Was it 62 minutes before Gibbs White scored? But up until then, I can't really think of too many chances that Spurs created. And it just felt like Solanke, who I have to say I'm quite surprised is in the England squad based on his performance. His goal record's not bad since he's come back, but I don't think he's looked quite up to speed. So it's good for him that he's in it. And he is probably the nearest when he's playing well to Harry Kane. So I can understand why Tuchel's gone for him. But I don't think he's actually playing that well at the moment, probably because he's not fully fit. Richarlison and Solanke just looked more and more isolated the more the second half drew on. I've already talked about how deep I felt Gray and Sarr were, but I just don't think Bergwall really added much when he came on. And Udogie, as I said, looked rusty as well. So neither sub really worked from where I'm standing.
No, I mean, maybe we should throw in the context here from the Forest side, because Pereira was very keen, wasn't he? And I thought gave a very interesting answer in the press conference afterwards about how basically his halftime team talk to the Forest players was, we got two options here. One, we carry on doing what we're doing. We try and beat Spurs at the game they're trying to play us at, which is basically long balls in the box, second balls and first balls, he said, didn't he? Or, we reset. He said we keep the same players, same shape, But he said, we restart and try and play the game we want to play, and he sort of framed the game almost as though in the first half, Forest sort of got drawn into this kind of long ball battle that Spurs were trying to pitch. And in the second half, they came out and basically played their own way. So maybe, if we're looking at through a Forest lens, maybe Forest played better in the second half. But I tend to agree with you. It struck me, especially the Spence one. Did he just kind of rage sub there? Did he kind of look at the footage of the corner and see that Spence let Jesus go for the header and think, oh, you're coming straight off and bringing on Bergvall and putting Porro at right back? It felt like a kind of panic substitution after, to be honest, what was a decent 45 minutes from Spurs. And I think, I spoke to a couple of people at half-time, other journalists who were kind of, not Spurs journalists either, who said, I think Spurs are going to win this game. They said, I think they played better. They're 1-0 down. I can see them coming back and winning 2-1 or 3-1. And I sort of felt, that was a fair take after the first half. And did Tudor need to kind of bring off two players, and particularly Van der Ven, because whatever you think of Van der Ven and whatever you think of his performances, I still think he gives this team a certain level of belief, in terms of like Romero as well, is that kind of character. And I think taking him off for the fans and for the players, I just think was too drastic a move, and I don't think it paid off at all.
I mean, Van der Ven sub is interesting. He's obviously been accused of not caring or all these other things that people seem to be talking about on social media, and he really had a pop back, didn't he, in that press conference the other day over that suggestion. But it is weird that he was the one who was subbed. You just think, I know Danzo actually was playing quite well, and he's done pretty well, but if you're going to make a sub, you would think you just shift Van der Ven back to centre back. But I suppose when you think about it, regardless of his attitude, just let's say, as he would definitely argue, that it's been completely spot on. Let's hope it is, and he cares just as much as anyone. His form's been pretty poor, isn't it? I mean, he made the mistake against Palace, slipped up against Atletico. Danzo's done nothing really wrong, so maybe you can sort of understand it. But specifically at left back, the doggy didn't look ready, did he? He didn't look ready to really affect the game in the way that they really planned. So no, that didn't work, and nothing else really that they did later really worked either. I suppose the one we were going to come on to is Xavi. I mean, Xavi, he's been probably the most talked about player on this podcast since he signed. We know he wasn't their first choice. They wanted Gibbs White, then they turned to Eze. Gibbs White obviously doing what Eze's done today, scoring against the team that wanted to sign him. Always had to be the way, of course. And
Semenyo as well. Every player Spurs missed out on this season is
just the way
he scored against.
It's just the way Tottenham do, don't they? But anyway, Xavi, I mean, how telling is that in this moment of need, the one they did finally sign isn't even given a chance. But I think it's harsh, like there's lots of times this season where I've been one of his biggest critics, but he played really well the other day. I thought, numbers alone, he's scored 2 goals. He's had the most ball recoveries along with Gray, which is pretty surprising for a player like him. And then you heard, I think it was Ali Gold asked Igor Tudor about him the other day in the press conference. I know you weren't there for this one, but it was quite damning with faint praise, Tudor's reply to him. So essentially the question was, let's talk about Xavi Simons, this stat about ball recoveries, try and get him in the team because he's obviously been in and out, hasn't played that much under Tudor. And Tudor's, essentially his response was, it was, I think he called it a beautiful surprise to see him effectively so motivated and putting in that work. I mean, I'm kind of paraphrasing, but definitely the phrase beautiful surprise came in. And I felt like, oh, that's quite interesting. That feels like almost like like I say, like a sort of, he's chosen his words carefully there. And I'm reading between the lines, it feels like he hasn't felt like Xavi's given him enough since he's been here for the quality of player that he is. And that would be backed up by the fact that he hasn't played him that often. But after that Atletico performance, and when you're playing at home, if you're not going to start him, which in itself is a choice, but maybe if you want to stick with this sort of 4-4-2 formation, where does he really fit in? If you're 1-0 down at half time and you're trying to change the game, is he not your first sub to try and make something happen, do something a bit different? And I haven't got the stats up in front of me. I don't know if you can work out exactly when he came on, but it was pretty late in the game, wasn't it? I think they were 2-0 down by then. So if I was Xavi Simons right now, I'd be feeling quite frustrated.
He came on in the 67th minute with Colin in a sort of double change, wasn't it, for Tell and for Richarlison. So yeah, you're right. It was late in the game when he came on. I think, I mean, it's not about reading between the lines, because you could just, read the starting lineups. I mean, since he basically played left midfield in that 4-4-2 against Fulham, I think you can basically say that Tudor doesn't trust him. He doesn't trust him. He didn't start him against Palace. He didn't start him away at Atleti. He didn't start him away at Liverpool. He started him at home to Atletico Madrid in a dead rubber, and then he didn't start him at home against Forest. I think in the Fulham game, I think Tudor saw something that he just did not like in that performance, and I guess I've sort of said that in the kind of, fist fight of a relegation battle, and he's talked about it in terms of, who's on the boat and who's not on the boat. I think Tudor probably thinks, Xavi's not my problem. He's not my project. I'm here for 2 months. Someone else can deal with this and try and get the best out of him as a talent that he is. But I've got to deal with the kind of nuts and bolts of this team and players that I can trust. And he clearly thinks that Xavi, just in the Premier League, where you cannot afford to let people run off you, he doesn't think that he has that kind of attention to detail that he needs. But I have to say, I think on the back of that Atletico performance, Tom, and I'm just going to agree with you here, I think having played like they played and Xavi scoring twice, including the winning penalty, late on in the game, I think that's that kind of soft management skill sometimes that I just feel like Tudor kind of lacks. It's that ability not to kind of make up your mind in such a hard way that you are not able to react to events. And Tudor should have seen this week, I think, and I think I've sort of defended him on this decision before, but I think after the Atletico game, he should have seen, actually, there's some momentum here. There's a player who has a little bit of sort of wind in his sails, and we need to back that. And I think it's easy to say in hindsight, but if we look at that first half, for example, where Tottenham had a lot of momentum, they had a lot of the ball and they had a lot of pressure, but they did lack a bit of craft, lacked a bit of subtlety, and maybe having Xavi in there might have just sort of unlocked the door.
Yeah, I mean, just look at these stats from Atletico. Most touches, 77. Most passes in the final third, 22. That's a key stat. Most duels won, 9. Most possessions won, 9. Most chances created, 5. Most duels won, 4. Most tackles, 2. Most goals, 2. Look, I guess it comes back to this age-old, why are Spurs good in the Champions League? Why are they terrible in the Premier League? Xavi Simons seems to embody that. But off the back of that particular performance, those stats, to my mind, deserved another chance in this game, either earlier in the match. We talked about him being like the Joker, as Germans would call it, off the bench, at halftime, or starting in this match based on that performance. I mean, in a way, I haven't had much of a problem with him, with Tudor sort of saying, this is, you're not playing well enough, you're not giving me enough. It feels like Tudor's like he was a big game player, big player for Juventus when Juventus were one of the biggest clubs in the world. Serie A was massive back then. I like that Xavi maybe comes with a bit of an ego, or he's played for these big clubs. He's not willing to Tudor won't suffer fools gladly. If he's got standards, everyone's got to meet them. It's not just because you're a £52 million playmaker who's played for Barcelona and PSG that you're going to get any different treatment. I like that. But in this particular scenario, he deserved it after the Atletico game. And it was proven, I mean, who's to say that had he started, Spurs would have won the game. But based on that performance at Atletico, provided, by the way, caveated to the fact that if he was fit enough to start, I don't think there's any suggestion that he wasn't in this game. It felt like a mistake, I think.
Tom, more broadly in the second half, like we picked through the bones there of some of the kind of players and tactical decisions, but it feels to me it comes back to that thing that Thomas Frank, talked a lot about, which is that this team really struggles to deal with setbacks, doesn't it? I always felt that in that game in the first half, if they'd scored, and that's where the kind of cruelty of this game, this day, and the whole sport is, right? Like if one of Tell's shots find the corner instead of the crossbar, then I think it's a completely different match, because the roof goes off that stadium and everyone probably has a kind of a big sigh of relief, and maybe it's a different game. But instead, of course, Igor Jesus heads in, when there's a sort of a hush in the stadium. I think at half time, there was a sort of an opportunity to reset, but I just thought that around the hour mark, I don't know if you sensed this, but it felt like there was this kind of desperation in the stadium. You know, like there was a kind of almost like it was borderline panic, but it was almost like everyone wanted the equaliser so much because they knew that to win the game they had to score kind of, you know, maybe early or whatever. That suddenly everything became rushed. Everything becomes kind of, you know, panicky, and there's no composure anymore. People aren't making good decisions because people are trying to, you know, players are trying to move the ball forward too quickly. And I don't know whether it starts in the stands or whether it starts on the pitch, but I felt like the plan that there was in the first half, which was kind of clear, just sort of went out the window, you know, from that period about the 50 minutes to about 60 minutes, say. And it was entirely inevitable that Forest were going to score a second on the break because Spurs just sort of they just unraveled, you know, and we've seen that so many times where Spurs will concede a goal and then collapse. You know, we saw it against Palace. Of course, we saw it against Atletico in very dramatic fashion. And I just don't know how they can get past this thing where they have to compete in a football match beyond just when the good moments. You know, they have to be able to kind of deal with the fact they're 1-0 down and say, yeah, we can come out and stick to the plan. You know, and okay, the fans are going to get, you know, anxious and nervous, but we can still win this game. That is what a good, superior, you know, confident football team do. But Spurs are so bereft of confidence, aren't they? That as soon as anything goes wrong for them, it feels like, and it's completely understandable, it feels like all that muscle memory of all those defeats, you know, it's very much like, oh, here we go again, you know, and you can feel that from the fans, and I think you can feel it from the players too. And I don't know how they get around that in the next few weeks.
No, I mean that's why many people think they're going to go down, because it's so hard to rediscover that in this ultra competitive Premier League, more competitive than ever. It might not be the best to watch, but you've already said, you know, Forest, you know, they've got good players. Wolves, bottom of the league, but they're beating teams left, right, and centre. It seems like if you're slightly off it, and we've been saying this for ages, which Spurs are, and they have injuries, and they don't really have much of a plan, you get punished, and that's what's happening. But my problem today, and this is why I feel like, I know it's hard to say this after the sort of personal tragedy he's been through, which we found out after the game, but I do feel like a lot of this result wasn't just on the players. Yes, they definitely said they're the ones who are supposed to carry it out, and they didn't play well enough to get the result. But I felt like the decisions that were made by Tudor and his coaching staff in the second half really negatively impacted their chances, because suddenly it was back to the Frank days. Particularly think of that Newcastle game, his last game in charge. And there was just not really much of a plan of how to break them down. And by the end, players just had no idea. They just didn't know what to do. And there were times when Romero or Gray, if he was very deep in the second half, and you could feel it in the crowd thinking, what are we going to do here? How are we going to break this down? There was like 5 players ahead of them, or 4 players. You've got Richarlison, Solanke, and the wide players, but they're all being marked. There's no real sort of movement, no obvious way of breaking them down, and that's why they didn't really look like they had much of an idea. And then, as you say, as the time wears on, you realise, you know, we need to win this game, not just draw it. Panic maybe starts to come in. The shape gets a bit more sort of disorganised. Romero, who wants to be the leader and try to, you know, make things happen, you start seeing him in the other side, you know, the other end of the pitch where he's not supposed to be. And it was interesting for the goal they conceded for Gibbs White. And I've never, you know, considered myself to be a tactical mastermind, but we're both sitting next to a top former professional player in Cascarino. And what did he say after that goal? I don't know if you were listening to him, but he was pointing to me saying, look at Romero, because Gibbs White plays it out wide to Hudson-Odoi, and then obviously Hudson-Odoi plays it back to Gibbs White, who finishes it. But if you watch the goal, Romero's jogging and he's not going quick enough, and if he gets back into that position, you know, faster, then maybe he cuts out that cross. But I don't know if that's being tied because you're up the end.
Well, what happens, Tom, I think a little bit, I agree with your point. I just wanted to say that what happens is that Sarr sees that Romero is basically not in that zone of right centre-back to kind of cut out the cross at the near post. So Sarr goes across there to kind of fill that gap. And as a result, he leaves Gibbs White free. So he's with Gibbs White on the edge of the area. And he decides, and I don't know if it's the right decision or not, he decides that basically the priority is to try and cut out the cross. So he basically goes to defend the near post. And as a result, when the pullback goes to Gibbs White's got, you know, the whole of the penalty area to himself. And you're right that Romero should have been the person who was defending the near post. And I wonder if it comes from, because we saw him, 5 minutes before Romero, maybe even shorter than that, basically go on that kind of, you know, hero's mission where he tries to sort of run 40 yards up the pitch. And listen, I have sympathy there because Spurs were drifting at that point. I think he basically wanted to grab the game by the scruff of its neck and say, look, I'm going to try and dribble the ball forward, show everyone what's what, and lift the crowd and lift the team. Fine. But if he's too exhausted as a result of that to defend properly 3 or 4 minutes later and Spurs concede the second goal, well, then it's a really poor decision, and you're absolutely right. I mean, I think it was on Romero, that goal.
That's a lack of discipline in a different way with Romero. I mean, he's a fabulous player, but he is an enigma. And I don't know, it's the kind of thing that when I'm watching my son who's, 6 and learning to play, like they all want to try and go and be the hero and make it happen. It's like, it's got to be, I understand him trying to lead, and he has it in his locker, let's be honest, like Van der Ven does, of being able to create something magical out of nothing. He's that talented a player, but it cost him today, that sort of lack of discipline, I think. And he looked tired in that particular moment. But I mean, even without that, it just felt like they ran out of ideas. And we've said that so much during the Frank period. I don't feel like we've said it that much during Tudor's spell. He said just keep conceding goals, and I've lost count. I suppose actually the run of conceding 2 or more goals actually ended, didn't it, at Liverpool, because it was only 1. But we're back to conceding 3 here. Couldn't score 1, and And let's take it back to the fans, actually, because I don't know if you read this piece. It was quite an interesting article in the Observer today from a journalist, I think, called David Aronovich, if I pronounce his name right. I think he might be a political journalist, but he's a big Spurs fan, and it was quite an interesting read because he was around when Spurs got relegated back in the 70s. So he remembers going to the games. He talks about a Bristol City game and an 8-2 defeat. He vividly remembers it. And he gives like a potted history of where Spurs have been from there to now, and how they've been sort of average for a long time, and then how the Poch era, where they got to, and how great it was when they beat Real Madrid, Cristiano's Real Madrid in 2017, which I'm sure you remember well, being like the sort of high point, not the Champions League final because they were on decline at that point. Anyway, he wraps up, and the reason I mention he wraps up this piece as saying the 2 issues to his mind why Spurs are where they are now are the injuries and the fans, effectively. The fans booing the team on a regular basis, and that kind of culture, I suppose, which I would say I don't share this opinion of those being the only 2 issues, and the booing is a thing across just regular football now, not just at Spurs. And you could argue not just Tottenham, but a lot of clubs, you start treating your fans as consumers or customers, well, they might start acting like them when it comes to giving feedback. But there you go. But that was sort of his point, that back in the 70s when the team got relegated, that just no one really did that, where it's become a thing now, and just so quickly it's kind of seeped into the club and affects the players on the pitch. But ironically, today, I felt like there was none of that. I mean, I know there was booing right at the end, so I guess that proves that it's still there. But by that point, it was 3-0, and it's just so desperate. But during the time when they really needed them, I thought the fans did really step up. I mean, they did their best, when they went 1-0 down, to try and G the team back up again. And even then, they just, it wasn't enough to get the players over the line. I mean, what do you think? I've sort of summed up that article without you having actually read it, I think. But do you see anything in that? Do you feel like the fans, in a way, at times have contributed to the downfall of the club this season?
I just don't buy that. I really don't. Like I always think this idea that the kind of the sort of external bubble has about kind of Tottenham fans as being, entitled. They think they're a Big Six club. They think they deserve to win trophies. They want to play brilliant football. I just don't agree with that. I don't think Spurs fans think they should win trophies and also play brilliant football, and they also think they should be entitled. They don't. The reason that Spurs fans are unhappy is when they see rubbish football, and that is the same in clubs all up and down the Premier League, by the way. Newcastle fans today are giving Eddie Howe a lot of stick because they are playing bad football and they're losing to their rivals. Tottenham have been playing bad football for the whole season. Under Thomas Frank, we witnessed it, Tom, with our own eyes. And if you have to go to a football stadium every week and pay a lot of money to see football that is not only unsuccessful, but also downright unimaginative, then you are allowed to express your discontent about that. And Spurs fans are not unique, beyond the Tottenham Hotspur Stadium. That is the same up and down the league. I think sometimes people forget that football fans are just people. Like, it's just a cross section of society who happen to be wearing the same shirt. Like, everyone, they are just human beings, and those human beings are the same at Arsenal, at Chelsea, at Spurs, at West Ham. The reason that Spurs fans are disappointed is because the team have been playing poorly, and when the team play really well, that stadium has liftoff. When the team is playing well, the atmosphere is fantastic in that stadium. We have witnessed that as well, and I think today was a great example of that. Like, the team could not have had, and this is how we started the podcast, they could not have had more cards in their hand today. They had all the fans absolutely behind them all the way through. And if I'm honest, I didn't think the overriding feeling, I think sometimes it's easy as journalists to kind of say the same stuff, toxic, angry, players, cowards, fans, entitled, use these kind of buzzwords. I didn't think the overriding feeling today was anger in the last 10, 20 minutes. I think it was disbelief. I think it's shock. I think it's sadness. I don't think the fans right now are pissed off. That's not their overriding emotion. They're done with that. That was back in September, October. Journalists who are still talking about Tottenham fans being angry are about 6 months behind, because they're not angry anymore. They're just full of disbelief and shock at where they are. And today they gave everything. They gave everything to help the team, and still the team didn't deliver. And we had that one guy, didn't we, who was kind of walking past the press box after full time, and it was basically, launching a kind of tirade at the analysts and saying, how much you guys paid, it's a disgrace, yada, yada, yada. But you know what? Like, it was mainly silence. People shuffling out, as if, we gave everything today and the team still couldn't produce a victory against this Nottingham Forest team. I'm sorry. When it comes to writing the pieces about where this football team and Tottenham team went wrong, and we get asked to kind of who's to blame, the fans will not be in my top 50 people who are to blame about where Tottenham are, and definitely not in the top 2.
Agreed. I thought it was interesting.
Tom, we should come on to Igor Tudor, shouldn't we? Because I think it's a big thing, and obviously you said that you think a lot of today was the blame should be laid at his door. Where does that leave him? We've now got this 3-week international break. Igor Tudor was clearly brought in, and we know this because we spoke to Johan Lange about it, and he said, that big reason why he came in is his record for short-term impact. His impact has been they've played 7 games, they won 1, which was a dead rubber in the Champions League. In the Premier League, which is obviously the priority, they picked up 1 point from 15. They've now got 7 games left. Do they have a better chance of staying up with Tudor or with someone else?
Well, I was trying to think about this before the game today, thinking about possible scenarios. If they win, obviously he stays on. If they draw, it's probably okay. And even if they lose, but it's not, it's the last minute winner and they've played well, and you can see signs of life and green shoots. You're thinking, I could see why they would stick, because that's generally what they've done, I guess. And, even at this late stage, it feels like a Hail Mary, to try and bring in someone, and the players will have to adapt again to a new manager. I just wonder, in this sort of the modern way of football, maybe I'm overcomplicating it, but just with the sort of intricacies of tactics these days, can you just bring in a last minute sort of Mr. Motivator, and can that really make a difference? But then they lose 3-0 at home to Forest, and it's slightly complicated, I guess. Maybe not. Maybe it is by Tudor's personal circumstances after the game. That might come into a bit. You've got a 3-week break now, and if they were thinking about it, which they were after the Atletico first game, when it was 4 defeats out of 4, then has the goodwill of the 2 previous results been obliterated by just the catastrophe of this particular result and second half performance? And do you think at this point, it's just worth rolling the dice? But it always comes back to the same argument we have: who do you bring in? I made the case after the Atletico game, where both George and I thought his time was probably going to be up, of saying I thought Sean Dyche would be a good shout. By all accounts, it seems like he's probably not up for a short-term contract. I suppose money talks. There could always be something put together, maybe. But it seems like that is a less of a possibility. So we come back to Ryan Mason, who, if they wanted to, they probably would have done already. So I'm definitely, put it this way, I'm definitely, as of tomorrow, and then when I'm going into England duty, I'll be on Igor Tudor watch. It doesn't feel like it needs to happen as instantly as it has done because of the international break and most of the players being away, as opposed to had it happen after Atletico because of such quick turnarounds. But I won't be surprised if suddenly we see the corner flag image come up. But I don't think it's as simple as those who will just look at the results and go, they've got to make a change. Although maybe even that, I sometimes feel like, as I'm saying that, is it a case of, not seeing the tree for the woods, if that's the phrase? The results have been
wood from the trees.
Wood from the trees, tree from the woods. Jesus, might try to edit that one out. Wood from the trees. It's very late now. I mean, is it? Am I overcomplicating it again? I mean, the impact hasn't really been there to see. That it comes back to what we say, the new manager bounce. It hasn't occurred.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you make an appointment for certain reasons, and this was the same with Frank, right? I'm having to rack my memory now, but the idea was that he would develop players, create a culture, and you go through the list, and after 6 or 7 months, none of those things have happened, and if anything, some of them have got worse. Well, that's the same with Tudor. The thing is, he was brought in, make an impact, create a culture, I don't know, get results, Premier League survival. Spurs are more in danger of going down now than when they sacked Frank. Right? I mean, this team, these players are in a worse state as we talk now after this 3-0 defeat at home to Nottingham Forest than they were after they lost at home to Newcastle, which was Frank's last game. At that point, I can't remember what it was, Tom. Do you remember what the gap was, the relegation zone at that point? 8 points, was it maybe?
Something like that.
It looked like sticking with Frank would risk them being pulled into a relegation battle. Well, now sticking with Tudor risks them, finishing in the bottom three, And then, maybe it's a debate for another day. Like, if they'd had stuck with Frank, would they be in this position? Would they have picked up, a few more points here and there, which, okay, it wouldn't have been spectacular by any means, but it might have them in a better position than they are now. That said, I mean, I have to say, I don't want to revise history. When they lost that game at home to Newcastle, it looked like the team were broken. It looked like the team was dead, right? And I don't think many of us, I don't think many fans disagree with the decision to get rid of Frank. The point is that Tudor hasn't made it better. He hasn't made it better. It's got worse, and I think the point you make, I think, is a valid one. It's a concern, isn't it? That if you bring in a new manager now, we've seen it with Tudor, how long it can take a manager to kind of get up to speed. I felt in those first 1 or 2 games, at least with Tudor, he was sort of learning stuff that we already knew, playing Xavi Simons as a left midfielder, like playing, I don't know, Archie at left back. He was just kind of picking stuff, which I sort of thought, we already know that, mate. Like, and I think if you bring someone in now, unless it's Ryan Mason, who does know these players, then clearly you're going to have another coach who's having to kind of find his way. And we're now in 6 or 7 games in for Tudor, and he's just now landed on a system that he believes in, 4-4-2, long ball, get it in the box, get Richarlison and Slanky on the end of it. He's found a plan he thinks works, but it's taken him, 3 or 4 weeks. If you bring in another guy, like, what plan are they going to come up with straight away that works? So there is clearly, a lot of risk. It's not an ideal situation in any regard, but I just think at any point in any Tottenham season to lose 3-0 at home to Nottingham Forest, I think would put a manager on edge. I think to lose this game at this point, I think was basically uncomebackable from, and I think they have to roll the dice again. I do. I understand what you're saying about the lack of alternatives, but I know that after the Atletico game, the idea of a permanent appointment was being considered again. And I just wonder if they might think about that. Perhaps they get someone and put a clause in where, the permanent appointment can leave if they do go down, that kind of thing, where there's some protection there. I wonder if that's a possibility, and maybe this podcast be overtaken by events, because it could be a busy day tomorrow, right? Anything else to add, Tom?
Well, I like uncomebackable. It feels very Ian Dowie of you, like bounce back ability. I mean, we said from day one of the pitfalls of an interim is do they command the same respect from the squad as a permanent manager? When, sadly, as frustrating as it is, must be for fans to hear, if players know the guy's not going to be around long term, just maybe they don't have quite the same authority as they would. Now, that said, Igor Tudor seems a pretty formidable character, so you'd hope that wouldn't be the case. But based on results, I'm not saying that's the reason why they've been going wrong, but if they were to make a change, ideally you'd love it. I would prefer it to be a permanent choice for that, to sort of tick that particular box. But who's taking it at this point? 7 games to go. It's a worse situation than it was if you'd done it a couple of games ago. I don't know. Well, here's a better question. Like, how if they are to make a change, are you expecting it to be done imminently? Is there any reason why we're 2 weeks down and then they change it?
I know that they had other options before Tudor, who some people were pushing harder for, and that there was an idea that there were a couple of other candidates that I think were very strongly considered. I wonder now if they go back to them, or whether they still have that same appeal. Because, you mentioned Sean Dyche, for example. I don't really see the merit in that, and that's just looking at it in black and white, not even taking into the kind of consideration what it would mean for Spurs and Spurs fans. I just think you've had the kind of Tudor approach, which is we defend better, we run harder, we work harder, we go longer. Sean Dyche is all of that, really, and I really rate Sean Dyche as a manager, by the way. But if you're going to move on from Tudor, then you need to try something different. Don't just get another guy who has the same sort of idea.
I agree, but he does have the Premier League background. I mean, are you talking about Marco Rose? Because because he was definitely one that seemed to be considered before Tudor. And one thing on his CV is his work with Xavi Simons before. He did very well with him at RB Leipzig. But are you really going to go and pick another manager? Or are they going to gamble on another manager who's never managed in this country, never played in this country? How would that go down with the fan base? I honestly think at this stage, I think it was George, or was it yourself? I forget who it was who made such a great case for Ryan Mason that by the end of it, I was like, yeah, I can't think of anyone else. You're not going to convince De Zerbi. If you couldn't convince him before,
George, I think, yeah.
If you couldn't convince De Zerbi before, all right, yes, he's had a bit more of a break. So maybe that comes into it. But why would he risk getting Spurs relegated on his CV at this point when he's got a great chance of having?
Okay, but Tom, let me put the counter argument to that, which I agree, and I'm not disagreeing with you. I completely take that point. But I guess the counter argument would be to say that actually, for a manager coming in now, if you back yourself, which we know all managers do, then your job is to keep Spurs in the Premier League, which a lot of managers would say, yeah, I can do that. And if you do that, let's run that through. If you do that, then you basically have the keys to the kingdom, because you have the fans on side, you have the club on side, you have a season next season where, to be honest, expectations have never been lower at the club. Like, you could finish in the top half and people would say it was a success. You have probably a summer where the board accept, you would think, that they need to sort of really renovate the squad and spend some money on new players. So it is a risk. I'm not saying it's not a risk, because no one wants a relegation on their CV. Although I would say that at this point, is there a lot of reputational damage? If you come in as a permanent manager at Spurs and you go down, and then you say, okay, I had 7 games to do it and they went down, and that wasn't really it wasn't on my watch. I don't know even if the scarring is really that heavy. Like, I take your point. I don't think, yeah, never came back. I mean, I take your point. I don't think many managers would want that, and I think they don't want to be associated with the kind of upheaval. But I do see a huge upside as well if you're a manager who comes in and pulls it off.
Yeah, you make a good case, and the one name that is sort of screaming out to me as you say that is Robbie Keane. I mean, it sounds like he would be very keen on it, but would be on a permanent basis. You're not just going to walk away from Ferencvaros for an interim role. But if they go back to this idea of thinking about a permanent hire, Keane ticks a lot of boxes, doesn't he? He bring the fans with him. He's obviously a club legend. He's done some good work at was it Tel Aviv and now Ferencvaros. I don't think he's like a really compelling case. It's not like I'm going like, oh, well, they'll definitely stay up under him or he's the man for the long term. But in this sort of desperate situation, if they are to make a change, I can see why he makes a lot of sense. And it's almost like, why not? It might cost the club more if they end up hiring him and they don't want him. But I suppose if they got relegated, then he might be the kind of manager who they'd still turn to anyway, because the pool's going to be smaller. So I think you can make a case for Robbie Keane, definitely, but you'd think it would have to be on the permanent basis.
Tom, I think we've pretty much run our race. I mean, I think I would still say, and I did kind of promise some optimism, and I'm not sure I've delivered it. So I just want to kind of, maybe finish on this. I still think Tottenham have better players than the players around them. And it's funny because I think I've sort of come full circle, because I remember when we were talking about Thomas Frank's future, and I think the one on this podcast who was often saying that I just don't think the players are good enough, and actually Frank is to blame for a lot of it, but I'm just not convinced by the squad. But I think it's a mid-table squad, maybe. Like I don't see it as an 18th place squad in the league, and maybe squad is too big a word because there are so many injuries. Even the sort of 12, 13 players. I mean, the bench today was quite strong. Like I think we all in the press conference room sort of said, "Wow, where's that bench come from?" Like all these kind of players who actually, could be starters. I still think there's a narrow path here where the right manager coming in and just lifting the players and giving them confidence and getting the morale going. Like we saw in that Atletico performance that this team can play, like they can pass, like they can create chances, and I still think that it's possible if you get the right coach with the right personalities, that there are still wins on the board for Spurs to get. And let's not forget, West Ham are still below them. They're still a point below them. That might not be the case because West Ham play first in the next round. They play Wolves at home or away, at home, I think, before Spurs go to Sunderland. So it's very possible Spurs will start their next match in the bottom three. But as it stands, they're still above West Ham, and they have a better goal difference, and they still have winnable games to come. So I still think it felt today at full time like it was staring into the abyss territory. But I still think there's still 7 games left. There's still time. Do you share any of my optimism or
no?
Not?
Yeah, literally, statistically, it's not over yet by and Tudor talks about that before the game. Pedro Porro had called it a final this weekend, and fans had called it a final, the equivalent of a final, and he was having none of that. He's like, no, it's not a final. He called it a 4-pointer, didn't he? He didn't even want to call it a 6-pointer. A 4-pointer is how he put it, which is quite a fun turn of phrase. But he was very much like, no, we're not at that stage yet. So you have to take that and hope that's the case. I think in these coming weeks, one thing that would be quite fun for us all to do, now that the squad is starting to recover a bit, is pick our individual, what we would do if we were the manager in terms of a team to stick with, because I think that's been one of the big question marks during Tudor's time. I mean, often due to limited options, but the amount of things he's tried, players in different positions, different personnel. I think we'd all like to see whoever the manager is come the other side of the international break, whether it be him or someone new, to sort of stick with something. And I think it'd be good to sort of work out what we all think, because it might be quite differing. There's a lot of options, a lot of different ways for Spurs to go about this. But I think that my final comment would be about James Maddison. I was watching him quite a lot today. So where we are is where the press box is at Spurs. If you can imagine, fans, if they can imagine where the tunnel is, where the two managers sit in the dugouts, we're to the sort of left of it, behind by quite a long way. The players the injured players sit to the right of the Spurs dugout. And I only really noticed that today because Maddison kept getting up. He was wearing a sort of beige cap and a sort of Burberry top. But you could just tell, even from as far away as we were, the passion that he had. I mean, it must be so frustrating for him that he's not been able to contribute. But you could just tell by his body language how invested he was in the game. I mean, just go back to the Europa League final when he'd obviously couldn't be involved, but how much he was invested. And if the rest of the squad can be as invested as what I seem to witness from James there, who we hope can play some part between now and the end of the season, then maybe that might be might be enough to galvanise them and get them out of this mess.
Yeah, it'd be even better to have Maddison on the pitch, wouldn't it? But I mean, at least kudos. Maybe we're hoping perhaps over the international break he'll be back and possibly kind of making some contributions in the next 2 or 3 games. So let's see. Guys, thanks a lot for listening. It's obviously a difficult time, difficult season. Probably not always the easiest of listens, but we hope we sort of provide some insight, some therapy, some moral support as well. But we'll be back later this week with a Q&A pod, I think. George and Marcus, I'm sure, busting to give their opinions. So stick with us. Thanks, as always. And until next time, cheerio.